Wajagam Shah. Nishtim Squajim, no? Diamond Gabbetstan. Swajim no Jiduxnia Guten Halne Mechta and Mina Wabun the Good. Daichand Wenji, we them go match it, Katayan Oten Haga, and Igan School go in the name, Methanga Wabun go when Jiji, we zabbit him go and out that. Nice to see you. Thank you. I'm greeting you in my Cree language this morning, opening, and really thanking you for inviting us to participate today. I've had the pleasure of being seated in the audience with you as a colleague, as a participant, and I'm really happy to see many of those people having those continued connected relationships, working partnerships, and to also see our former leadership in the room. Bonjour, hello, bienvenue à tout le monde. C'est vraiment un grand plaisir pour être ici, d'être ici pour moi avec mes collègues dans l'Assemblée. Aussi, j'aimerais en premier dire un grand bonjour à la chef nationale, mon amie Cindy. Thank you, National Chief. Nice to see you again, my friend. I want to also acknowledge the regional chiefs, the chiefs from across the country, many of you that I've had the privilege and opportunity to meet with throughout the Assembly every day. We took a number of engagements, side meetings. I've stopped and spoken to people in the hall. It's really an opportunity, I think, coming here, being here all day, every day, to have that access with you. For me, I see it as a privilege. I also enjoyed those side meetings when I was running in the restroom and having some chats with the ladies. I think that's a little moment to share. I've seen many of you, really dressed beautifully with your beadwork, representing your nations, your culture, and the skill that you carry. So I want to take the time to speak to that. I'd also like to welcome our relations for bringing us into this territory, for allowing us to gather here, and for welcoming us and holding us up in prayer. I also want to acknowledge the elders, the many youth that I've seen here participating. Very pleased to have met with them, including my own nation's youth who have come to participate and build relationships. Our knowledge keepers and the community leaders who have worked with us and prayed over us in the actions that we take today. I first want to acknowledge that many First Nations communities are currently facing wildfires and floods, and those who have responded to the emergencies this past year have really been essential. We know this morning that we're waking up to over 180 fires and many communities at the front line of battling them and trying to get into spaces for safety and evacuation. I always want to be thankful to the Chiefs of Ontario for hosting me in this morning's caucus to speak about that and giving me advice and direction on the way that I do my work. Thank you for the resilience that you've demonstrated not only this year, but also with last year's wildfire. Since becoming the Minister of Indigenous Services, I've had the opportunity to meet with many leaders across the country. I've also enjoyed the opportunity to not only have those meetings with you, but come to your communities and engage with you. I recently came back from a trip out west. I was on Vancouver Island for the first time. Enjoyed the privilege of getting some fresh fish on the shores of the riverbank there. Only one. I'd also like today to really focus my remarks on 4 key areas that are really priorities that are driving the discussions that I'm having with you. First and foremost, that children and families are at the forefront of my decision-making. We know that children are one of the most valuable resources for the future of First Nations, that clean drinking water is a conversation that we're engaging in and taking that next step. Acknowledging and hearing the messages of housing and infrastructure are some of the greatest needs, and that I am responding and ensuring that empowering communities with decision-making is an important step. Home, protecting our future members, and the rights to make decisions are some of the principal components that I'm using in looking at our files. First, supporting First Nations children and families is really one of my top priorities. They are, as I said, our most valuable resource. Far too long, First Nations children were separated from their families and communities because of systems that were not designed by them. But this is changing. We are doing good work in this place. This past May, I had the opportunity to take an important step forward with the implementation of the Ontario Final Agreement on long-term reform for First Nations Child and Family Services. We introduced this working relationship based in ceremony, which was a truly powerful moment. I want to ensure that it is understood that I am here to support communities in reclaiming the authority and care of their children and the families that need the support. and these must be designed through services that are held and determined by First Nations for First Nations. I want to congratulate the Chiefs of Ontario and the Anishinaabe Nation on this achievement. They've really done incredible work in this space. My department is continuing to engage with First Nations in every region across the country, looking to ask questions and explore and negotiate long-term reform and ensure that the process forward reflects their unique nations and regional realities. We are backing these efforts with serious long-term funding. We want to ensure that the continuity, stability, and predictability is available to them. We're seeing more First Nations exercise jurisdiction in Bill C-92. I had the pleasure of being in Uashat Maliotanam. J'étais dans la communauté pour signer la première entente avec la Nation, Québec et Ottawa pour assurer que leur processus va avancer. J'ai vraiment eu un grand plaisir d'être là avec eux. I also want to speak about Jordan's Principle. I've had the conversations in many of the rooms and with caucuses over the past few days, and one message has been extremely clear, not just in Jordan's Principle, but in all of the files at ISK, ensuring that there's predictability in funding for long-term planning. Our goal is to ensure that the system that is in place works better, has less barriers, and that we are reforming to lift and ensure that we are not adding to the hardships of families that are trying to provide support to their children. Another priority that you've seen come out is access to clean drinking water. Last month, I had the opportunity to introduce the First Nations Clean Water Act alongside one of the largest financial commitments to support First Nations. This legislation reflects more than 6 years of work of consultations and engagements that was done in the first form of the bill. I believe that I have tabled this bill, I have introduced the bill, and the next step really lays in the work that we will do collaboratively through the legislative process. But what it does to me signal is we're creating a pathway for First Nations to incorporate and lead in a water commission and co-develop long-term funding models. Our government, as I've said, backed this with over $7 billion to ensure that we're able to do this work, a historic investment and the largest ever in the first year of this government. There's an incredible changing world, and I know that I want to talk to you about legislative process. This is going to be the place where I have the opportunity to engage with you and listen, but also do the work alongside my parliamentary secretary. Yesterday, I spoke to an update of housing and the urgent priority. I know that Minister Alty Robertson have launched consultations with partners, and we're looking to ensure that your voice and your direction lead the development of new Indigenous housing. First Nations want to ensure in all of the files that we're working on that long-term, predictable, stable funding is in place, because that is the commitment that's needed for community to succeed. But one of the things that comes along with that commitment is defining outcomes, with measures that are based in the aspirations and visions that you have set for your members, that you understand and that you work with a community that is going to respect the successes that you see fit for them, that you are actioning the vision. Canada must truly be a better partner. This is my objective. And First Nations must assume greater responsibility in that partnership with shared accountability and, in instance, taking the lead in that next step. The path of self-determination is measured by outcomes, improving lives and identifying the determinants that your nation set. This requires and demands from us, leaders in this room, those who are elected, and my colleagues who come to this stage with you, and also from our leadership within the federal government, a change in our relationship. We must ensure that we're reporting on the work that we do. We must ensure that we are looking to the vision that you're setting, and that these challenges are met by everyone in the room, that we're going beyond advocacy to build and invest in capacity of governance, of infrastructure, of the institutions, and most importantly, the human capital and community. We move from joint responsibility to the results that members have identified. We look to serve them. We also want to demonstrate what success looks like. Every new success will also create greater expectation. Every achievement creates a higher standard. Every transfer of authority requires stronger governance, stronger institutions, and greater accountability. This is what nation building looks like. This is how we uphold rights and truly empower nations. This is what I seek to do with you. I look to you for support, I look to you for continued guidance, and I look to you for a continued working relationship.
Lawlin, Minister Gull-Masty. And again, just to highlight that she will also be with us this afternoon. So I don't think a Minister of Indigenous Services Canada has ever been so present at our Assembly, and I want to recognize that. Our next speaker, Minister of Public Safety, the Honourable Gary Anandasangaree.
Thank you, Elders, National Chief Woodhouse, Nepinak, Regional Chiefs, and delegates from across Canada. I want to acknowledge that we're gathered on the traditional territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people. Before I begin, I want to acknowledge the devastating impacts of wildfires currently burning across Canada, as well as floods that have been impacting communities throughout. My thoughts are with the families and communities who have been displaced from their homes and communities, and I want to thank the first responders for their heroic efforts. Indigenous Services Canada and Emergency Preparedness are actively supporting the response, and I'm working closely with Minister Olszewski to ensure every necessary resource from Public Safety Canada is deployed to help people be safe. I'm grateful here to be alongside my Cabinet colleagues to discuss our roles in supporting First Nations rights and empowering nations as we advance our respective mandates from the Prime Minister. And I want to acknowledge Minister Gull-Masty, Minister Chartrand, as well as Secretary Belanger for their work. I've had the privilege of getting to know many of you at this Assembly quite well over the years, and you will know that I approach my role in government, including as Minister of Public Safety, from the perspective of our collective journey towards reconciliation. I know deeply what it means to look for safety, dignity, and a place where your fundamental rights are secure. In seeking that safety, we must also confront uncomfortable truths about our own institutions. This includes the overrepresentation of Indigenous peoples within the criminal justice system. It also includes explicitly the painful and historical impact of our CMP surveillance on First Nations peoples and leaders. This legacy has left deep wounds, and our government is fully committed to working directly with the Assembly of First Nations and national Indigenous organizations to address this history, provide transparency, and rebuild trust. I am firmly committed to working collaboratively with First Nations and with the provinces and territories to better support First Nations-led public safety approaches. Over the last year, I've been hearing directly from your communities about the immediate challenges you face. I've heard your urgent concerns regarding the impact of organized and oftentimes transnational criminals, those who are proliferating guns, drugs, and trafficking in your communities. We are partners in confronting these threats head-on to restore community safety and transform policing. We're already taking action to back up this commitment. Just yesterday, we announced $2 million investment to directly combat organized crime, drug trafficking, and money laundering in Quebec's Indigenous communities under UMECO, which is Unité Mixte d'Enquête sur le Crime Organisé. This funding will break down silos, allowing 8 First Nations police services to integrate directly into specialized units and joint investigations with the Sûreté de Québec. I acknowledge that this work will require additional federal investments, especially additional funding that addresses the gaps noted in the PBO report. Our government will be there to support First Nations police services and with predictable and sustainable funding that empowers them to better support public safety in our communities. We'll also be working closely with First Nations as we develop and implement local community safety initiatives that complement the role of police officers, including expanded support for First Nations safety officers. As we look to transform public safety, we must also look to the strong work that's happening out west. I want to acknowledge the leadership of Corey Wilson and the BC First Nations Justice Council. Their work from expanding Indigenous Justice Centres to advancing the country's first ever Indigenous Diversion Centre is a masterclass in how to deliver holistic legal supports and meaningful diversion. They're proving that providing upfront trauma-informed wraparound care fundamentally breaks the cycle of over-incarceration. With our new Commissioner, Talal Dakalbab, through Correctional Services Canada, we're determined to build on this momentum. That's why our government is committed to expanding Section 81 agreements, ensuring First Nations have jurisdiction, the resources and the authority to supervise, heal, and support their own people. In closing, safety is the foundation upon which everything else is built. Enfin, la sécurité est le fondement sur lequel tout le reste repose. When your children are safe, when your lands and cultures and languages are respected, and when your laws are enforced by your own people, that is not just public safety, that is self-determination, and this is how nations thrive. We have tough conversations ahead of us and systemic legacies to address. That is why I'm here to listen, to be held accountable, and to work as a true partner. Thank you, Miigwech, merci, merci. Let's do this important work together.
Hola, Minister Anandasangaree. We will now move on to our next speaker, which is the Honourable Rebecca Chartrand, Minister of Northern and Arctic Affairs.
Great. Good morning. Bonjour, Tanseanin, Wapanuni, Kwe, Indigenous, Wabashke, Mangan, Dudem, Pine Creek, Duck Bay, Vogarn, and Dunchi, Winnipeg, Utanang. Good morning, everybody. It's such a pleasure and an honor to be here with you today. Before I begin, I want to acknowledge that we're gathered on the unceded and unsurrendered territory of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe peoples. I also want to say thank you to National Chief Cindy Woodhouse-Nippanak, my relative, and thank you to the regional chiefs that are here today, chiefs, elders, youth, leaders gathered here today, and especially for those prayers that were made each and every day for all of us that are here today. I also want to acknowledge the First Nations families and communities who continue to face the impacts of wildfires and flooding. I raise my hands to the chiefs, the emergency coordinators, the first responders and volunteers that are working with families and communities that are going through devastation right now. For those of you who don't know me, I am Anishinaabe Innu. I am from Treaty 4 territory. I have the honor of serving as Canada's Minister of Northern and Arctic Affairs, but more importantly, I represent Churchill, Keewatin-Nuckaski in northern Manitoba. It is 3/4 of Manitoba. It is the 5th largest riding in the world. It has 73 communities, 42 First Nations, and 19 remote isolated communities. It is also made up of 78% Indigenous peoples in the riding. As a First Nations woman, I came into this role believing something that has only become clear over the past year. For thousands of years, Indigenous peoples have secured the North. Today, Canada is finally beginning to understand that. The North is not Canada's next frontier. It is one of Canada's oldest homelands. For generations, First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people have lived on these lands. We have built thriving communities. We have developed sophisticated systems of governance and trade and cared for this place long before Canada existed. That truth should shape every decision we make about the future of the North. Because today the world is looking north. The conversations about Northern Arctic and Indigenous self-determination and sovereignty are ongoing. We are talking about critical minerals. We are talking about trade, energy, infrastructure, climate change. But I believe those conversations must begin with Indigenous people, with the people that have always lived and occupied these lands. And at Northern and Arctic Affairs, we also know that human security is national security, which is why we have been centering dual-use language. If families cannot afford food, if housing is overcrowded, if roads, airports, and ports don't connect communities, if young people cannot see a future at home, then we cannot honestly say we are building a stronger North. Strong communities create a stronger North. And a strong way to do that is to ensure that we are working with all of you here in the room today. That is why I believe the role of Northern and Arctic Affairs is changing. Our responsibility is not simply to administer programs. It is to help bring the whole of government together around the priorities of Northern and Indigenous communities. Too often we hear that communities are having to navigate multiple federal departments, funding programs and regulatory processes just to move forward on important priorities. Our responsibility is to improve coordination, remove barriers, strengthen partnership, and ensure governments are working together, not to ask communities to connect all the dots, but to lean in and help connect those dots with and for community. Over the past year, we have begun doing exactly that through the work in CanNor and through the department. We have worked across government to help advance projects of national interest that Northern communities themselves have identified as priorities. Projects like the Mackenzie Valley Highway or the Grays Bay Road and Port or the Port of Churchill, and other strategic infrastructure that can improve affordability, strengthen supplies, create Indigenous economic opportunities, and build healthier, more connected communities. But I also want to be very clear. These projects cannot and should not move forward without Indigenous rights holders. Across much of the North, modern treaties establish the co-management institutes that guide land use planning, environmental assessments, and responsible development. Those agreements are protected under Section 35 of our Constitution. Modern treaties are not barriers, and we've come to understand this. They are Canada's blueprint for responsible development, which is why we're happy to support projects like Grays Bay that are Indigenous-led. Our role is not to weaken institutions. Our role is to strengthen them, to improve them from this perspective, to support early engagement, and to ensure Indigenous governments are helping to shape projects. Because projects will move faster if Indigenous peoples are engaged in the beginning. And so that is the work that we are leaning into in Northern and Arctic Affairs with the territories and the leadership in the territories. The same philosophy guides our work on Nutrition North. Over the past year, we have listened, we have traveled to communities, we have held regional engagements, and we also brought together in an unprecedented summit all 124 communities that are receiving the Nutrition North subsidy. Communities are leading the reform. They have told us that the subsidy alone will not solve the food insecurity issue. They are asking us to think bigger, to think beyond the subsidy, to invest in community, in harvesting, in food preservation, regional and local solutions and processing, community food hubs, supporting Indigenous entrepreneurs, and creating a local economy, a local food economy. That is exactly the direction we are taking, because the future of the North will not be measured only by what we ship to the North. It will also be measured by what Northern communities are empowered to build for themselves. Across the North, communities are already leading this work. In Sambake, community gardens, greenhouses, and food sharing are strengthening local food security. In Northern Manitoba, harvesters are teaching communities and young people how to hunt and preserve traditional foods so that they can feed families throughout the year. This is Indigenous innovation. It is the work that our people have maintained for thousands of years on these lands. So we want to ensure that every community kitchen, every regional processor is led and built for and by Indigenous peoples. We want to continue to create those opportunities where we're ensuring that you are the problem solvers of the issues that you're dealing with, and we must get behind those solutions and that vision. So our goal is to build genuine partnerships and to help ensure every decision we make reflects one simple principle: that the strongest North is built by strong Indigenous communities. Thank you for your time. Merci, miigwech, nakame.
Thank you, Minister Chartrand. And our final speaker before we go to the floor will be the Honourable Buckley Belanger, Secretary of State for Rural Development.
Good morning, and thank you very much for that introduction. And to all the delegates here, I sincerely thank you for your kind patience, as you've heard from my colleagues, on certainly some of the work that we've been trying to ascertain is important to the First Nations across this country. I want to thank National Chief Woodhouse-Nepinak for her kind invite to join the AFN this morning. I also want to recognize the sign language support team. I think the fact that you've got that service for those that are having a difficult time hearing what is being said, I think that's just a really cool thing to do. Tanse, bonjour tout le monde. Je pratique mon français, donc je vais vous faire une petite introduction en français aujourd'hui. Mon nom est Buckley Belanger et je suis le secrétaire d'État pour le développement rural. Je suis très content d'être parmi vous ici. Again, I'd like to thank my colleagues here, Ministers Gull-Masty, Anandasangaree, and Chartrand. I want to point out that it's a privilege to share this panel with these colleagues who are committed to improving outcomes for First Nations peoples. Whether we're talking about clean water, healthcare, public safety, infrastructure, or major projects, none of this happens without real partnerships. As we've consulted on Canada's Rural Development Action Plan, we've heard the same message across the country. Rural, remote, and northern First Nations face many of the same challenges as other rural communities, but also ones that required tailored solutions. One of the biggest challenges is capacity, because too often communities don't have the resources to navigate complex federal programs. I spoke about this yesterday with the Saskatchewan AFN caucus. We are working on an action plan that works to make programs easier to access, reducing barriers, and helps communities know what programs are even available to them. Economic reconciliation also means ensuring First Nations are full partners in major projects, with equity opportunities and long-term benefits for our communities. I also see incredible leadership we're seeing right across the country, and for the high standard many First Nations are setting for accountability and good governance. Our government wants to recognize and reward that excellence, because strong, accountable communities are building lasting success for the future generations. In closing, I want to say at the end of the day, it's all about listening. It's all about working together and delivering results that make a real difference in our people's lives. So again, I thank you for your kind patience in hearing all of our presentations. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Belanger. And also, just to say, ton français était pas pire pantoute, just le dire. So again, we've got about 20-ish minutes, let's call it, being respectful of the people who are in the line. If we can get to our points, we can get this done. Microphone number 1, please.
Judy Wilson, Red Hummingbird from unceded territory of Secwepemcúlecw. Thank you. I waited a very long time to get to the mic. I had questions for the other ministers as well. But what I'm going to ask is if the delegates, the councils, and the youth, all the ones in this assembly, can you please stand if you hold our children at our heart? Our children are at the center. Can you please stand, all of us? Please stand to honor our children. Thank you. Because this assembly are the ones that put forward the message, the resolutions to do the work with the National Children's Chiefs Commission. We hold all of our children at the heart and at the center, and these are very important messages, and I would like you to hear what our chair has to say.
Dringwinzi I wanted to just direct my question at Minister Gull-Masty. The work that this Assembly has directed of the National Children's Chiefs Commission is to work towards ending Canada's discrimination against all Indigenous children. Every child matters in this country. We did the work as directed by this Assembly. We put forward the Loving Justice Plan, a 4,000-page document that is rooted in our culture, in our way of life, in our core needs. We based the plan on a minimum standard, the minimum standard that this Assembly and every region put into the plan. And we are looking to Canada to honour that plan. And what we're seeing right now is Canada not honouring that plan. Canada has its own vision, and they're going across the country meeting with every region and meeting nation by nation, implementing a plan that they design, not the minimum standards that you've designed, that you put in place. We have to look at complete eradication. We have to look at Canada's practices and how it's delivered services to our children. Children are still being apprehended. Children are still being violated. We have the answers. We want our children home. We want to take care of our children. We are looking at the capacity. We have to look at nations and nation building. We have to look at the resources flowing into our regions and the service delivery models that we've built up and we design. And we're looking to Canada to honor that, not to go across the country to try to divide us nation by nation and building a plan that we didn't agree to, that Canada designed. Once the Human Rights Tribunal makes its final and binding decision and honors our plan, the Loving Justice Plan, that's what we ask Canada to do, not to go out across the country implementing a plan that we see as continuous fault and discrimination that violates our children and violates our human rights, the human rights of our children. It makes me so angry that our children are still being apprehended and put in care and not being respected. Our families matter, our children matter, and we ask Canada to honour the Loving Justice Plan, the minimum standards, and work with us to implement the plan that the Chiefs and Assembly put forward for Canada to honour. Not some 22-page document that Canada devised. I ask this to honour the people and honour the Assembly. Merci.
Thank you, Chief Frost. Be looking towards microphone number 2, please.
Nagadagonte. I'm Jennifer Duncan. I'm a Dena lawyer. Chief Hope has yielded his time for me to ask this question. Thank you, Minister Gary, for your commitments to work with us as partners to end the overrepresentation of Indigenous peoples. In November 2025, Canada's correctional investigator, Dr. Ivan Zinger, announced he was resigning. He said he was leaving, frustrated because Correctional Service Canada and successive governments had failed to adequately address systemic human rights issues in Canada's correctional system. He warned that if governments continued to dismiss the recommendations of his office, the courts, not governments, would ultimately compel reform. Today, Canada has no permanent correctional investigator. At the same time, the position of Deputy Commissioner for Indigenous Corrections, created in 2023 in response to the calls for justice of the National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls, and described by your government as a major step toward reconciliation, is now being filled on an acting basis by someone who is not Indigenous. These positions matter because Indigenous people continue to represent 1/3 of those incarcerated in prisons. They matter because Indigenous people continue to experience systemic discrimination within Canada's correctional system. And they matter because First Nations members like Joey Toussaint continue to live with the consequences of this system. Joey has spent more than 3,000 days in intermittent solitary confinement, while his nation continues to advocate to bring him home under Sections 81 and 84 of the Corrections and Conditional Release Act. His case reminds us that these issues are not theoretical. They affect real people, real families, and real nations. Independent oversight and Indigenous leadership are not administrative details. They are essential to accountability, reconciliation, and restoring confidence in Canada's correctional system. Minister, will your government commit to appointing a permanent correctional investigator without delay? And will you work with First Nations to ensure that the Deputy Commissioner for Indigenous Corrections is an Indigenous person whose appointment is made in agreement with First Nations, consistent with the nation-to-nation relationship and the purpose for which the position was created? Masi.
Thank you, Proxy Duncan. I see no one online, so if you can go to microphone 1, please.
Thank you. Chief of the Nation, Pimichigamak, David Monias, has got a questions for the Minister Rebecca Chartrand and also Minister Gull-Masty. I didn't get a chance to ask the Minister of Natural Resources and Energy when they were here, as well as Minister Aldi. So I'm going to ask the question for you guys to ask the questions, or maybe you have the answers. The natural resource transfers agreements transferred control over the lands and natural resources to the provinces without our knowledge, without our participation, and the consent of Treaty First Nations. Our treaties did not cede or surrender our lands, waters, or natural resources, and our inherent sovereignty predates Canada. Will the government commit to reviewing and replacing the national transfer resource agreements with a treaty-based framework that respects First Nations sovereignty and jurisdiction? Will Canada recognize that our lands, waters, and natural resources are our equity in national projects and ensure that First Nations are owners, decision makers, and recipients of long-term revenue sharing, not merely parties to be consulted after decisions have been made? Economic reconciliation cannot be achieved if First Nations remain excluded from ownership of the wealth generated from our own lands and our own resources. How will Indigenous services support First Nations in becoming equity partners in national projects through capacity funding, access to capital, and long-term resource revenue sharing? Sorry, I'm having a hard time breathing. Will Canada recognize when First Nations agree, pursuant to our treaties, to share the use of our lands and natural resources, that contribution agreements and that contribution constitutes our equity and should result in ownership and a fair share of our revenues generated from these projects that are generated from our lands? Okay. Canada has committed to reconciliation, treaty implementation, and economic reconciliation, yet the natural resource transfer agreements continue to stand as a barrier to the exercise of First Nations treaty rights, sovereignty, and jurisdiction over our lands and our resources.
30 seconds.
Will your government commit to working directly with Treaty First Nations to replace the NRTA with a modern treaty-based arrangement that recognizes First Nations as governments and equal partners and identifying, developing, and owning and benefiting from natural projects of interest? Treaties did not cede lands or resources. The NRTA altered the treaty relationship without First Nations consent. 2 more points. The First Nation lands, waters, and natural resources are our equity and should be considered as our equity in any national projects. Economic reconciliation requires equity ownership, shared decision-making, and revenue sharing, not merely consultation or impact benefits. Thank you for listening to me. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chief Munias. I would look towards microphone number 2, please.
Good morning, ministers. Good morning, Assembly. My name is Brennan Manikizik. I am the proxy for the Ebb and Flow First Nation in Manitoba. I have 2 questions, both directed for Minister Anandasangaree. First is, Minister, thank you for your presentation this morning. Will you work with First Nations to fully implement and equitably fund Sections 81 and 84 of the Corrections and Conditional Release Act as Parliament originally intended in 1992? Recently at the United Nations, at the Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues, The United Nations Permanent Forum identified that upon Canada to substantially expand alternatives to detention, including community-based sentencing, restorative justice programs, and adequately funded, independently operated Indigenous healing lodges, ensuring that such alternatives are resourced at parity with conventional custodial institutions. The United Nations rarely single out individual states in their recommendations. The fact that Canada was specifically identified demonstrates the seriousness of the ongoing mass incarceration of Indigenous peoples. Canada has acknowledged this crisis for decades. Parliament acknowledged it when it enacted Sections 81 and 84 of the Corrections and Conditional Release Act in 1992. So now, more than 30 years later, the United Nations has called on Canada to do what Parliament envisioned when it enacted those provisions. The second part of my statement is on behalf of the Chief of Mount Usipi, God's River. Many First Nations across Canada, particularly in northern Manitoba, have been spending vast amounts of funding from either own source revenues or other sources in order to provide frontline security measures in their home First Nations. There's been a lot of resources spent in terms of ensuring that First Nations are adequately protected, that the safety is paramount for their members. Will Canada entertain a plan to look at cost recovery initiatives that First Nations have spent to ensure that their citizens are adequately looked after in their home communities? Thank you.
Thank you, Proxy. Seeing no one online again, we will not be able to get to the end of the list, but Proxy, or microphone number 1, please.
Bonjour, I'm a proxy chief for Namagusagagan, the First Nation that was wiped out. And what I'm doing is I'm going to actually give my time to Proxy Chief Miles Quiswa, who's the Deputy Chief of one of the communities I represent.
Good day, everyone. Miles Quiswa, Nadamizagwik, Nishnabé, formerly known as Pick Wilbert. This is regarding community safety. First thing I want to talk about is time. When violence starts, time is everything. The FBI studied 160 violent attacks. They learned that most of these attacks were over in 5 minutes or less. Almost half were over in 2 minutes. That is how fast people die in those events. On September 4th, 2022, a tragic event in the western provinces of our First Nation. A first 911 call came in around 5:40 a.m. Police got to the nation at 6:18 a.m. It took nearly 40 minutes after the first 911 call for officers to arrive. If an attack ends in 5 minutes and help is 40 minutes away, or people are alone when it matters most. Safety must live in the community. Help is 70 kilometers away from my community. Point 2, drug trade. Drug dealers come to us not by accident. It is a business decision. Organized criminals do their homework. They know how few officers we have when officers are working or not working. They move drugs when no police are available. Our Department of Community Safety and Security gathers intelligence. We know that our territory is being used as a drug warehouse. Drugs are stored on our land and then moved out in the communities of the lake shore of Lake Superior, northern shore of Lake Superior. In any battle, that side holds the higher ground wins. Organized crime holds the higher ground because there is no one there to stand against them. And while they hold that high ground, we bury our people from overdoses, we watch families fall apart, we watch our culture being wounded by addiction. It is time we take the high ground back. Reactive policing is filling the jails with our people. When police are far away, small problems grow into big ones. A call for help becomes a crime scene. Police arrive after the harm is done. That is called reactive policing. We need proactive policing. When police are present and visible in the places where trouble happens, crime goes down. When police only show up after the harm is done, there's only one tool left: arrest, charge, jail. But when help comes early, there are other paths: restorative justice, healing circles, elders sit in with a young person before that young person becomes a case file.
15 seconds.
Indigenous adults are locked up at a rate 10 times higher than non-Indigenous adults. Canadian law already says courts must consider alternatives to jail for people, but you cannot use an alternative when the crime has already gone too far. Early help means smaller problems. Smaller problem means real choices. Real choices mean our own justice in our communities, our way. That is a change. That is the change. Fast response, early help, less harm, our own justice, fewer of our people behind bars. Every link in that chain starts with safety resources in our community. We're not asking to be treated differently on crime. We are asking to be supported a better way. And investment, not funding.
Chief, we are go towards closing, please.
We're going to have 3 more minutes.
Your time's up. Time's already up.
I gave him my 3 minutes.
And plus mine.
Plus yours.
Thank you. You give the ministers.
We'll give you an extra minute for this.
Okay. Most Canadians with trouble at their door at 3 a.m. pick up their phone and the police come. Not tomorrow, not in an hour, now. They call that normal. We call that a luxury. Our people deserve what other Canadians have. Police who come when needed, not after. We need investments in our Indigenous police services. Give them what every police service in this country takes for granted. Invest in our nations that are ready to take care of themselves through tiered policing. The community builds its own safety team. They handle the calls that do not need a badge or a gun. They watch, prevent, and respond first. Tiered policing is not new. It is how safety works in every healthy community. Layers of protection working together. My community has started it. We wrote our own trespass and safety in Okanagan. Our law applied on our land, protecting our people. We built our own records, management systems, track our own intelligence. We know who is in our territory and what they are doing. We're just getting started and already reaping benefits. Every dollar invested in community safety saves $10 in courts, jails, hospitals, and funerals. Invest in us and our nations will show this country with safe nations like us. Feel the right to feel safe. Think about Canadians tonight. They will lock their door to go to sleep and think not about safety at all because they don't have to. This is what safety feels like. It is the freedom to not think about it. Our people do not have that freedom. When trouble comes, we know we are on our own. We're not asking for more than what other Canadians have. We are asking for the same. And in closing, I'll leave you with this. On my territory, drugs are warehoused for the towns around us because no one is there to stop it. Our people fill the prisons in this country while the tools of our own justice sits unused. All because the ground was left empty and someone else moved in. We are not waiting for permission to protect our people. No one should be left behind. We require an investment in our police services to fully implement tiered policing. Our people have the same right as every Canadian, the right to feel safe at home. It is time that right came home to our lands.
Thank you, Roxas. We have time for one final speaker, so I'll go to microphone number 2, please.
I want to say thank you to the Anishinaabe and Algonquin people for us to be able to do this work, and thank you to the ministers for being here. I want to direct my comments and questions at Minister Gull-Masty. You said that children are at the forefront of your priorities, and so I want to remind you that First Nations rights must define the reformation of child and family services. First Nations have had real voices in development of the Loving Justice Program application. We know that there still remains a decision by the Human Rights Tribunal on the 2 applications that are before them. The bottom line is that the new Services Act needs to end discrimination forever for our First Nations children. I want to ask you to quit fighting our children in the courts. That process is not helpful to us and not helpful to our children. The Caring Society and the National Children's Chiefs Commission, with the direction of chiefs and communities in Canada, has developed a 4,000-page submission that looks at all the issues and eventualities that could come up for our children and families. First Nations do need to be making these decisions. The capacity, pardon me, I also heard you say that, and I'm quoting you, that that these services have to be determined by First Nations for First Nations. If this is true, why are you not promoting the Loving Justice application instead of reconstituting a colonial budget-driven application when you could be pushing forward a plan that many of our leaders, children, families, experts, and communities has developed?
Chief. I will now look towards our ministers and maybe begin with Minister Anandasangaree.
Thank you very much, and thank you all for those questions. Let me just briefly address the three questions that were directed at me. First, Jennifer Duncan, let me just confirm to you that we will have a Deputy Commissioner of Indigenous Affairs within Corrections, as well as a new correctional investigator. We're in the process of finalizing those names, and they will be coming to their roles very soon. What's important about corrections is that we do have a new leadership within corrections. We have Talal Dakalbab, who's been appointed as a new commissioner, who brings an extraordinary vision and experience to this role that looks at systemic racism as an underlying factor, as well as overrepresentation. So the mandate that I've given him is to ensure that the overrepresentation, particularly of Indigenous people, are addressed at most significant level, with a plan that will ensure, as part of our Indigenous justice strategy, as part of the work that we've been doing over the number of years, to ensure that we address the core issues around incarceration. So I'm very much committed to that. I addressed that in my remarks. Brennan, Manok Ezek, again, I want to just reiterate our commitment on Section 81 and 83. If there's specific proposals that are available, I'll be more than willing to meet with you directly on this, or through our commissioner. But again, these are critical steps for us. We are accelerating our engagements on Section 81 and 83 releases, and it is absolutely critical that we have alternatives to detention that are based in community, based on community values and lived experiences, as well as long-standing cultural and linguistic practices. So that is something we were absolutely committed to doing. With respect to God's River, in terms of frontline policing, and this is a question I know many others will have, we will, Manitoba particularly, I know, is going through some very difficult challenges. We're in discussions with the government of Manitoba. We have a formula, as you're aware, that contributes equally or somewhat equally between the province and federal government. We are looking to advance that even further, including infrastructure supports. So on God's River, I would invite you to connect with our representative who's here from Public Safety, who can give you more information. Finally, on Nananug Asimek, I hear you, I hear the frustrations, and I really do think you're speaking for many others as well, because this is a common trend we're seeing. Drugs going into communities, outsiders going into community through organized criminal networks, and those are the type of cooperation that we're looking with law enforcement. So in Quebec yesterday, we have one such step that we've taken, but we need to do more, and I fully acknowledge the work that lies ahead. It's not easy. The communities are struggling to deal with these situations in a very real way, and they're looking at their communities being shaken up. And our commitment is to ensure that we not only have the adequate funding, but we have resources outside of funding that will ensure that there's better coordination between broader law enforcement, because if we do look at First Nations policing as a standalone or community-based policing, the ability to do investigations, the ability to address issues of transnational organized crime, the issues around homicides and others where you need a very specific and a greater level of expertise, cannot be expected to be done in a local level. So we are looking to see how we can collaborate broadly with the RCMP and other police of jurisdiction. But glad to continue this conversation with many of you at a later time. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister. Minister Chartrand.
Yes, thank you for that question. And I just want to acknowledge that, public safety is a very important issue. I met with a number of our chiefs yesterday on that very topic, particularly from Garden Hill, St. Teresa Point, the Island Lakes area. So this is a remote, isolated region that is representing 17,000 people, and I do want to acknowledge the very painful stories that were brought forward by the chiefs there. We know that there are huge addictions in our communities and that we are being targeted by cartel because there is a lack of presence there of enforcing public safety within the communities, and we continue to work collaboratively on those solutions. So I really appreciate Minister Anandasangaree being here. But some of the things that we talked about specifically, or that I heard, is that, you know, the chief wasn't able to be here today because he was attacked by somebody who was on meth, and you know, that person tried to poke his eyes out, and so he had to go into surgery to recover from that. A mother had killed her baby because she was also on meth, and so these are real painful stories that that are very hard-hitting. And so we also talked about solutions, and I know that these are coming forward in letters that have been written both to Minister Anandasangaree and myself, and it's empowering communities to address these issues themselves. And so I look forward to following up on those recommendations that are coming forward, and I will certainly share them with Minister Anandasangaree. In terms of your question, Chief Munias, thank you so much for being a strong leader and a strong voice in Manitoba. The issue you've raised really does go to the heart of Canada's relationship with First Nations, and I, as a First Nations rights holder, also understand the issues within this and why many First Nations are still looking at this transfer from a treaty and rights-based lens. You know, when we think about the any decision regarding the NRTA, it would have significant constitutional implications and would require, you know, federal government working with provincial and, more importantly, with First Nations themselves. This is not within my mandate, but I will continue to speak on behalf of the communities that I represent, and ensuring that my own voice as a rights holder is at the table, which brings the understanding of the concerns around the NRTA, especially as it impacts the prairie provinces. So thank you.
Thank you, Minister. Minister Gull-Masty.
Thank you, Miigwech. Thank you, those of you who came to ask questions at the mic. You know, I do want to first start by saying we will continue to be here throughout the day. If you did not have the chance to come to the mic, always willing to meet with you and take some time with you. I want to touch a little bit on the majority of questions that were directed to me with regards to long-term child reform. You know, I've had the opportunity to be in this assembly as a former leader, and I've seen the evolution of the discussions of long-term child reform over a number of years. And I also, I was not present, but I did online see, you know, the direction that the Assembly took when the last deal that was offered did not succeed. You know, to me, when I saw the evolution of that process and I saw, you know, a large number of First Nations decide to take their own path in Ontario and ask for their own process, that to me indicated that, you know, there was something that needed to be looked at that's outside of that box of what, you know, what we see in the work that was being done here in the Assembly. And I want to say this with the most respect. I want to say this with the most love and compassion and encouragement for the work that has been done. I want to acknowledge that I have always been clear in my position that I believe that the methodology and the work that was put into the Loving Justice Plan is one that reflects what First Nations want to see. But I also have to be very frank and transparent in saying that when one part of the Assembly decides to take their own path, when almost half of First Nations in Canada decide to pursue their own agreement, this to me is an indication that more needs to be done in that space, and that's where I'm coming from. Regional agreements are based on a framework, they're based on a discussion. We engage communities with exploratory conversations. We ask them to draw information from the framework that we provide. We also ask them to do the work in identifying other information or additions they want to seek, and even draw from the Loving Justice Plan itself. The work that we're doing in this place is to ensure that first and foremost, we're creating stability and predictability and responding with urgency. This has been a long, ongoing discussion, and I think for me, when communities indicated that they wanted to take their own decision for the future of their members, when rights holders come to me, I'm going to respond in that space. And I also think that while we know that there are many voices at this table, while we know that work has come out of Assembly, we also see that communities and First Nations have come forward and wanted to make decisions for their own children. And that is my objective, to ensure that I respect the rights of those communities to choose for themselves. And I also think, as I said yesterday in my comments to the caucuses, there is more than one way to offer healing. There is not one sole path to walk. We have to respect that in the work that we do. If those individuals wish to choose for themselves what they want to do, I will support in that space. And I think that this is a message that also needs to be heard by the tribunal, that they must recognize the rights of First Nations to choose for themselves. The courts are making decisions in this space. I'm trying to support a process that implements the right to decide in reform. You know, I see that the Living Justice Plan shaped a lot of the work, a lot of the information, a lot of the data. I see that there's a strong philosophy behind it. What I'm proposing is a methodology that is a vehicle for regional agreements to be shaped by nations to decide and define that unique space that reflects them. So I think that while we are all trying to work together and serve children and protect children, the urgency that we need to undertake in this process means that we have to be committed to the long-term stability that's required. This is a termed agreement. I believe that part of that work also has to be shaped by the collection of data that's based on the success that communities want to set as markers as part of their reform, with outcomes that they have chosen for the future of their nations, and that our job as government is to understand those things and shape them for that next step. I'm not here to fight or dispute the work that's been done previously. I'm here to respond as a minister to those who have come to me and made this request. Because like I said, I think part of the work that we do in this space is the acknowledgement that there is more than one path to healing. So I really appreciate those of you who have shared with me your comments, for all avenues in moving this work forward. And I appreciate those of you who have come to me across the country and wanted to do this kind of engagement. I look forward to our continued work together. Miigwech.
Thank you, Minister. Minister Belanger.
Thank you very, very much. I just want to reiterate some of the work ethics of many of you folks that have brought these issues forward. I live in a remote northern Indigenous community as well, and many of the folks that are on the stage today are aware of many of the communities that sometimes are not heard. And the first thing I would point out to folks very quickly here is that we must create the dialogue to build a stronger Indigenous perspective when it comes to developing our country. The most recent example of outreach, I would say, is under C5. I think our Prime Minister has given us the opportunity to engage with him on many fronts as to how we, as Indigenous people, can architect a new Canadian economy with us at the forefront to make sure that we never repeat the mistakes of the past. Some of the examples in the One Canadian Economy under C5 talks about environmental standards. It's been very clear that C5 is not meant to be used as an environmental shortcut. The standards under the environmental perspective under C5 are very high, and the Prime Minister has been quite clear on that. The second point that he's made, and I really am keen to listen to a lot of the words that he speaks, is that the Indigenous community must be engaged. That's what he said, that Indigenous communities must be engaged. So my point and challenge to the gathering here today is, how does that look like? You have powerful examples, and I'll use some of them, like the natural gas opportunity in BC. It's going to be just a phenomenal opportunity for the First Nations in BC. You look in my own riding of northern Saskatchewan, there's a Foran Mining that's working with the largest band, the Peter Valentine Cree Nation, on developing this resource project in northern Saskatchewan, along with the Cumberland House Cree Nation. They are heavily involved as well. You look at the leadership coming out of Manitoba, the Port of Churchill. All these projects have Indigenous engagement, but how does it look? How do we improve on that to make sure that we're never left behind when it comes to resource development opportunities? The provinces have a role to play as well, and I'll close on this point, is that we, the Indigenous people, and those that serve in cabinet, very strong ministers, they are trying to figure this out, and this is the reason why we attend many of these events, to seek your advice. And that advice is valued because you bring to us different ideas, different perspectives. My challenge to you today is to show us how you would do it. And yes, we have national aspirations, but don't forget there's individual territories. There's individual bands. The provinces have a role to play. The territories have a role to play. Look at the examples in Iqaluit, Nunavut. They are looking at all kinds of resource opportunities there. So as we crisscross the provinces as ministers, we learn one important lesson. The Indigenous people, the First Nations people want to architect that new Canada, and what does that look like? And the efforts we're trying to look in many ways, I look at Anandasangaree, our minister. He wants to create safe communities because a functioning safe community will help us with our labor needs. In northern Canada, Minister Chartrand wants to make sure that the First Nations people benefit from some of the heavy investment into our Canadian security. You know, as we all know, we're going to be developing a defense opportunity in Canada's north. She's trying to position the Indigenous community. And you look at some of the work that my colleague next to me, Gull-Masty, Minister Gull-Masty, is doing, really strengthening the Indigenous community through some very strategic child and family services issues, but also some of the infrastructure needs. We are following some of their work, but we have some more work to do in terms of consultation, and that's exactly my point, is that we need your advice. We need your help. We need your architectural skills on how to build that new Canada. And when Minister Hodgson gets up and says we're at war, it's a trade war, he's absolutely right. We have to assert that Canada is a free trading nation that's engaging her Indigenous people and valuing the environment which we all know Canadians want. So it's a grand vision, but I'll close by saying we need your engagement. Thank you.
Thank you, ministers. So again, this will bring us to a close on our second panel. So I'd like to thank the Minister Gull-Masty, Minister Anandasangaree, Minister Belanger, and Minister Chartrand. And we do have a small token of appreciation from our regional chiefs.